When a flight attendant rudely demotes a black family from first class, she believes she's putting them in their place. But when the plane lands, an astonishing truth changes everything. They own the airline. What happens next will make her question everything she's ever believed. Before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring stories. Hannah Brooks had been a flight attendant for almost 15 years. She'd seen it all: cranky passengers, last-minute requests, and chaotic delays. Known for her ability to stay composed under pressure, Hannah had built a reputation for her professionalism in the aviation industry. She worked for Stellar Airways, an airline renowned for its luxury and elite service. Stellar prided itself on creating an in-air experience akin to five-star hospitality, and Hannah was one of their star employees. She excelled at meeting the high expectations of their exclusive first-class passengers, treating them like they were the only ones on board. For Hannah, this wasn't just a job. It was a way of life. That evening, as passengers began boarding Flight 782 to Florence, Hannah positioned herself at the front of the gate, her posture commanding and her gaze sharp. She surveyed the crowd, mentally preparing for who might demand extra attention, who might have complaints, and who could cause complications. Her eyes stopped on a family standing confidently in line: Daniel and Alicia Carter, along with their 2 young children. They weren't flashy, but something about them made Hannah pause. Daniel was dressed in a crisp navy suit, while Alicia wore a simple but elegant dress. Their children stood quietly beside them, well-behaved and composed. On the surface, they seemed like a typical affluent family who could afford first-class tickets. Yet something about them didn't sit right with Hannah. As the Carters approached the gate, Hannah noticed their boarding passes marked first class. But an inexplicable feeling gnawed at her. She felt they didn't belong. It wasn't their attire, which was immaculate, or their polite demeanor. It was something deeper, something Hannah couldn't quite name but was quick to act upon. When they reached the gate, Hannah gave a tight smile. "Would you mind stepping aside for a moment?" Daniel's brow furrowed slightly. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice calm but tinged with suspicion. Hannah hesitated before replying. She scanned their boarding passes again, even though they were clearly valid. "I just need to confirm your reservation," she said, her tone clipped but polite. "There seems to be some confusion." Alicia and Daniel exchanged a knowing glance but complied without protest. They stepped aside as Hannah walked off to consult with her supervisor. The seconds stretched into minutes, and the tension in the air became palpable. Behind the Carters, murmurs began to ripple through the boarding line as other passengers grew restless. Finally, Hannah returned, her smile colder than before. "Please follow me," she said. But instead of leading them to the spacious first-class section near the front of the plane, she directed them toward the back, near the restrooms. The seats were cramped and far removed from the luxurious amenities they had paid for. This wasn't an oversight, it was deliberate. Hannah believed the Carters didn't fit the image of the premium first-class passengers she prided herself on serving. To her, they seemed out of place. Daniel remained silent, his expression unreadable. Alicia quietly held her children's hands, her composure unshaken, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of weariness. She'd faced this kind of treatment before, but tonight wasn't about creating a scene. It was about reaching their destination in peace. The Carters settled into the seats Hannah had assigned, their quiet dignity in sharp contrast to the slight they had just endured. Little did Hannah know, her assumptions and actions on this flight would come back to challenge her in ways she could never have imagined. The Carters focused on getting through the flight to Florence. Once seated, they settled into their seats as the plane ascended into the sky. Hannah Brooks moved through the cabin, greeting passengers, serving drinks, and attending to their needs. But an unsettling feeling tugged at her mind whenever she thought about the Carter family. Hannah couldn't quite place it, but something about their presence didn't sit right with her. As much as she tried to focus on her duties, she found herself glancing at them more than she intended. The Carters were seated calmly. Daniel was absorbed in a book. Alicia helped one child color in a travel activity book, and their youngest had drifted off to sleep, her small head resting on Alicia's shoulder. They were quiet, polite, and made no demands. If anything, they were more composed than many of the other first-class passengers Hannah had encountered. Yet the irritation in her simmered, unprovoked and inexplicable. Hannah returned to the galley, where her co-worker, Lisa, was arranging trays of champagne flutes. Lisa was new to Stellar Airways, eager to learn but still finding her footing. "Everything okay out there?" Lisa asked, glancing at Hannah as she adjusted the drinks. Hannah hesitated before responding. Finally, she decided to share her thoughts. "You noticed that family sitting in the last row of first class, right?" she asked in a low voice. Lisa nodded, her expression neutral. "Yeah, the one with the 2 kids? They seem nice. Why?" Hannah leaned in, lowering her voice further. "Doesn't it feel off? First class isn't exactly cheap, and they're just—" She trailed off, her tone implying the rest. Lisa frowned, unsure of how to respond. "But their tickets are valid, aren't they?" she asked cautiously. "Of course they are," Hannah said, rolling her eyes. "But that doesn't mean much these days. People have ways of working the system. I've seen it happen before." Lisa didn't press further, but Hannah's words hung heavy in the air. As Hannah resumed her rounds, her irritation only grew. She convinced herself that her instincts were justified and began keeping an even closer watch on the Carters, searching for any behavior that might validate her suspicions. Meanwhile, Daniel and Alicia were quietly aware of the growing tension around them. Alicia, ever observant, noticed that their row's service was unusually slow. Other first-class passengers received their drinks and snacks promptly, yet their row seemed to be overlooked. When they pressed the call button to request water for their daughter, it took an inordinately long time for a flight attendant to respond. Alicia remained composed, but Daniel leaned closer to her, whispering, "They're watching us." Alicia gave a small, calm nod. "Let them," she whispered back. "We've seen worse." Daniel sighed deeply, but didn't respond. He checked his phone, glanced at an email, then set it aside. He didn't want to escalate the situation, but the blatant mistreatment was hard to ignore. This trip was supposed to be a special celebration for their family, not an exercise in endurance. Unbeknownst to Hannah, another first-class passenger had noticed her behavior. A middle-aged man in a sharp suit, seated a few rows ahead of the Carters, watched her with a critical eye. He observed the delay in their service and the subtle hostility in Hannah's demeanor each time she passed their row. Though he raised an eyebrow at the interaction, he chose to remain silent for the moment. As the flight continued, the tension grew thicker. Hannah tried to immerse herself in her tasks, but her usual sense of control felt shaky for the first time in years. Every glance at the Carter family seemed to unsettle her, their quiet composure challenging her unspoken biases in ways she couldn't articulate. Her confidence, which had always been her anchor, was beginning to falter. Hannah Brooks felt a simmering unease as the dinner service began. Instead of starting with the Carters' row, she deliberately delayed serving them. While the other first-class passengers dined on gourmet meals, clinked glasses of fine wine, and engaged in soft conversations, Daniel and Alicia Carter waited patiently, their menus untouched on the tray table in front of them. Alicia glanced around discreetly, noting how smoothly and attentively the attendants served the other passengers. Leaning slightly toward Daniel, she said in a hushed voice, "This isn't an accident." Daniel sighed, leaning back in his seat and crossing his arms. "I know," he muttered. His voice was calm, but his frustration showed in the tight set of his jaw. "But we're not giving her the satisfaction of seeing us upset." Finally, Hannah approached their row. Her expression was neutral, but her stiff posture betrayed her discomfort. Setting the menus down with a subtle sharpness, she said curtly, "Apologies for the delay. There's been a backlog in the galley. Can I take your order now?" Alicia smiled politely, her tone steady. "Of course," she replied without missing a beat. She and Daniel gave their orders with the same composed demeanor they had maintained since the start of the flight. Hannah jotted down their choices quickly, then left without the warmth she reserved for other passengers. As the meal service dragged on, Hannah's behavior didn't go unnoticed. The man in the sharp suit, seated a few rows ahead of the Carters, watched with growing interest. Sipping his whiskey, he observed how the family's service was markedly slower than the rest, and how Hannah's interactions with them lacked her usual attentiveness. When the Carters finally received their meals, it was glaringly obvious. They were served last. Despite this, Alicia maintained her poise, cutting into her dish with graceful ease. Daniel offered her a small smile, a silent show of admiration for her composure amid the blatant disrespect. Their children, as if sensing their parents' calm resolve, remained quiet and well-behaved. Midway through the meal, the man in the sharp suit decided he couldn't remain silent any longer. Catching Lisa as she passed by, he flagged her down with a low, firm voice. "Excuse me," he said, "but could you explain why the family in the last row of first class was served so late? It's hard not to notice." Lisa froze, her eyes darting nervously toward Hannah, who was standing just a few feet away. Hannah turned toward the man, her face tightening at his pointed question. "Everything is under control, sir," Hannah said quickly, her tone clipped as she attempted to deflect. The man raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Under control? From here, it looks like there's a deliberate effort to ignore them. Do you think that's appropriate for passengers who paid for first-class service?" Hannah's cheeks flushed, but she forced a professional smile. "I'm sorry if it appeared that way, sir. That was not the intention," she replied. The man studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he turned back to his meal. Lisa, looking increasingly uncomfortable, mumbled an excuse and retreated to the galley. Meanwhile, Hannah tried to compose herself, but her nerves were fraying. She stole another glance at the Carters. They weren't making a scene, nor were they complaining. Yet their calm presence felt like a quiet, unspoken rebuke, a challenge she wasn't equipped to confront. For the first time that evening, Hannah felt a twinge of unease that went deeper than frustration. Something about this situation was starting to feel much bigger than she'd anticipated, though she couldn't quite put her finger on what it was. The rest of the dinner service proceeded uneventfully on the surface, but the tension lingered in the cabin like an unwelcome guest. Hannah busied herself with her duties, moving briskly between the rows, but no matter how hard she tried to focus, her thoughts kept circling back to the Carters. Their quiet dignity unnerved her in ways she didn't understand and couldn't ignore. Meanwhile, Daniel exchanged a glance with Alicia, silently acknowledging the growing tension in the cabin. Alicia, always the steadying presence, leaned in and whispered, "We've been through worse. Let's enjoy what we can." She rested her hand lightly on his arm, a small gesture of reassurance. Daniel gave a short nod, but his jaw remained tight. Nearby, Hannah stood near the galley, catching fragments of murmured conversations among the passengers. The man's earlier comment had stirred quiet discussions. No one openly criticized her, but Hannah could feel the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere. Her grip on the situation was slipping, and with it came an unsettling nervousness. Why was this family getting under her skin? She had always prided herself on maintaining authority and professionalism, but now, for reasons she couldn't fully grasp, that confidence felt shaky. As the flight wore on and the cabin lights dimmed for the night, passengers began to settle in. Some drifted off to sleep, while others watched in-flight movies. The Carter children had fallen asleep, their heads resting peacefully on their parents' shoulders. Daniel and Alicia, however, remained alert, occasionally glancing toward the galley where Hannah lingered. Hannah, unable to suppress her growing frustration, leaned toward Lisa and muttered, "I don't understand why they're acting so entitled. It's not like they're royalty." Her voice was low, but the bitterness was unmistakable. Lisa hesitated, visibly uncomfortable. "I don't think they're acting entitled," she said cautiously. "They seem like normal passengers. Maybe we should just treat them like everyone else." Hannah shot her a sharp look. "You don't understand," she snapped. "I've been doing this long enough to know when something feels off." She didn't elaborate further, but her words lingered uncomfortably between them. Lisa opened her mouth as if to respond, but thought better of it and quietly retreated back to the cabin. Unbeknownst to Hannah, Daniel had quietly risen from his seat and made his way to the front of the plane. With the same calm composure he'd displayed all evening, he spoke briefly with the captain's assistant. His demeanor remained steady, but there was a quiet intensity in his request. After a short exchange, the assistant nodded and escorted him to the cockpit. Inside, Daniel had a brief and private conversation with the captain. When he returned to his seat, Alicia raised an eyebrow but didn't say a word. She trusted her husband's judgment and knew that whatever he had planned would be handled with the same quiet dignity they'd maintained throughout the flight. Meanwhile, Hannah remained oblivious to what had transpired in the cockpit. She continued her rounds, her tension simmering just below the surface. Most of the first-class passengers appeared relaxed, but a few had started to take notice of the subtle dynamics at play. They saw how Hannah bristled whenever she approached the Carters and exchanged knowing glances. Whispers began to spread, though no one confronted her directly. As the plane soared through the darkened skies, the cracks in Hannah's carefully composed facade began to show. The Carter family's quiet stillness unnerved her in ways she couldn't explain. They weren't demanding anything, nor were they causing any disruption. Yet their mere presence felt like a challenge she couldn't ignore. Despite her efforts to stay focused, Hannah's thoughts kept drifting back to them. Her frustration morphed into a gnawing sense of dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that she had underestimated this family, and the question of why loomed larger with every passing moment. The rest of the cabin remained calm. Most passengers were either sleeping soundly or immersed in their entertainment. But for Hannah, each glance at the Carters felt heavier, like a quiet reminder of something she couldn't put into words. While she busied herself trying to maintain a semblance of control, Daniel and Alicia continued observing the unfolding events around them, their expressions unreadable. The weight of their composure was unnerving, but Hannah had no idea just how much her actions during this flight were about to cost her. It should have been a standard flight, but Hannah Brooks felt an invisible weight pressing down on her in the first-class cabin. Nothing about this evening was unfolding as expected. In their seats, Daniel Carter adjusted slightly, leaning closer to his wife. "Everything set?" he whispered. Alicia looked at him, her expression calm but unreadable. After a pause, she gave a small nod. Her eyes drifted to their children, still peacefully asleep, then back to Daniel. "Are you sure this is necessary?" she asked softly. Daniel offered her a faint smile, one that conveyed both reassurance and quiet determination. "It's not about us anymore," he replied. "It's about everyone who might face this." Alicia held his gaze for a moment, then leaned back into her seat, her hand resting protectively on her daughter's arm. Meanwhile, in the galley, Hannah found herself battling an inexplicable sense of agitation. She had always trusted her instincts, and tonight was no different. Yet instead of clarity, her thoughts were clouded by frustration and confusion. Why did this family, who had done nothing overtly wrong, bother her so much? She told herself it was because they challenged her authority in subtle, almost imperceptible ways. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. The man's unshakable calm, the woman's quiet grace, it all felt like a personal affront, though she couldn't articulate why. As Hannah filled out a routine report near the galley, the sharp-suited passenger who had spoken to her earlier approached again. He held his whiskey glass loosely in one hand, his expression composed but scrutinizing. "Excuse me, miss," he said in a low voice, careful not to disturb the sleeping passengers. Hannah looked up, already bracing herself for another critique. "Yes, sir? Is there something I can assist you with?" The man tilted his head slightly, studying her. "You've worked for Stellar Airways a long time, haven't you?" "Yes, I have," Hannah replied, keeping her tone polite but curt. 15 years. Why do you ask?" The man gave a faint smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Impressive," he said. "Then you must understand how crucial customer experience is to this airline. I assume the Carter family in the back row paid the same premium price as the rest of us. Wouldn't you agree they deserve the same level of service?" Hannah's mouth tightened, her discomfort evident. She forced a professional tone. "Of course, sir. All passengers are treated with equal care." "Are they?" The man countered, raising an eyebrow. "Because from where I'm sitting, it doesn't look that way." Hannah's hand gripped the edge of her clipboard tightly. "If there's a concern, I assure you it will be addressed," she said, her voice clipped. The man took a deliberate sip of his drink, his eyes never leaving hers. "Good," he said evenly. because you never know who might be watching." With that, he turned and walked back to his seat, leaving Hannah rooted in place, her stomach churning. The cryptic comment lingered in her mind, heavy with unspoken meaning. Had he been speaking about himself? Did he know something about the family that she didn't? For the first time, Hannah felt as though she might have miscalculated. She shook her head, trying to dismiss the unease. She had dealt with difficult passengers before. She could handle this. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't shake the gnawing anxiety that had settled in her chest. The hours dragged on, and Hannah's nerves continued to fray. Every glance at the Carters left her more unsettled. Their unbothered composure, even in the face of her thinly veiled hostility, felt like a quiet rebuke. It unnerved her further, making her feel as though they knew something she didn't. Her mind replayed the man's parting words in the galley. "You never know who might be watching." What had he meant, and why had the comment felt so directed at her? As the plane began its gradual descent toward Florence, Hannah forced herself to focus on her tasks. She collected trash, assisted passengers, and prepared for landing. But no matter how much she busied herself, the growing tension in her chest refused to subside. This flight was different, and for the first time, Hannah was beginning to realize she might not be the one in control after all. The cabin was secure, but no matter how much Hannah Brooks tried to keep herself busy, her gaze kept drifting to the last row of first class. Daniel and Alicia Carter had gently woken their children, who now sat quietly, gazing out the window at the glowing city lights below. Alicia adjusted her daughter's blanket with care, while Daniel checked something on his phone, his expression calm and composed as always. In the back of her mind, Hannah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant was about to unfold. It wasn't just the Carters' quiet presence, it was the way other passengers had started sneaking glances their way, whispering amongst themselves. The air in the cabin felt different now, heavier. Hannah felt as though she was standing on the edge of a moment she couldn't control. As the plane touched down on the tarmac, the first-class passengers began gathering their belongings. Preparing to disembark, Hannah noticed Daniel slip his phone into his pocket before exchanging a brief glance with Alicia. The look between them was subtle but deliberate, as though they had silently decided on their next steps. Hannah moved quickly, ensuring the other passengers were ready to leave, but she couldn't help keeping an ear out for the Carters. Her nerves were on edge, and she wasn't sure why. When the cabin doors opened, Hannah took her place near the exit to bid the passengers farewell, her professional smile firmly in place. One by one, the first-class passengers filed out, offering polite thanks to her and the rest of the crew. The man in the sharp suit passed by, giving her a long, pointed look but saying nothing. Finally, it was the Carters' turn. Hannah felt her posture stiffen as Daniel paused in front of her. He looked her directly in the eye and said, "Thank you for the flight." His tone polite and measured, but somehow it made her stomach tighten. Alicia offered a similar courteous nod, her gaze steady and unreadable. "You're welcome," Hannah replied quickly, forcing her smile to stay in place. She was eager for them to leave. As the Carters exited the cabin, Daniel turned back briefly to glance at the first-class section, his expression thoughtful. Hannah couldn't tell if it was a simple farewell or something more significant. But the look left her feeling oddly exposed, as though the control she'd worked so hard to maintain throughout the flight had been quietly taken from her. Moments after the last first-class passenger left, another flight attendant approached Hannah with a puzzled expression. "The captain wants to see you in the cockpit," she said in a hushed voice. Hannah's heart skipped a beat. "What for?" she asked, keeping her tone even. "I don't know," the attendant replied with a shrug, "but he said it's urgent." A jolt of panic surged through Hannah, but she quickly smoothed her expression. Adjusting her uniform and taking a deep breath, she told herself it was probably a minor issue, something routine. But as she walked through the now empty first-class cabin, the unease in her chest grew heavier. Deep down, she suspected this had something to do with the Carters, and whatever awaited her in the cockpit was likely to change everything. Hannah stepped into the cockpit, where the soft hum of the plane's systems filled the tight space. Captain Wallace, a seasoned and composed leader, sat in his chair, the co-pilot beside him reviewing the final landing procedures. As she entered, Captain Wallace looked up, his expression unreadable. "You wanted to see me, Captain?" Hannah asked, her voice steady as she clasped her hands in front of her, projecting professionalism. Captain Wallace nodded toward the empty jump seat. "Take a seat, Hannah." Her heart pounded as she obeyed, lowering herself into the seat and glancing nervously between the two men. "Is something wrong?" The captain exhaled deeply, folding his hands on the console in front of him. "Hannah," he began, his tone calm but firm, "we've received a message from corporate. It concerns the passengers in row 3A and 3B. Hannah's stomach dropped. Hannah Brooks didn't respond immediately. Her mind raced. What message? Why now? She had thought she'd handled the situation discreetly, or so she believed. "The Carter family," Captain Wallace clarified, his sharp eyes fixed on her, gauging her reaction. "They're not just passengers, Hannah. They're the owners." Hannah blinked, her brain struggling to process the words. "Owners?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes," Wallace said, his tone growing firmer. "Daniel and Alicia Carter are the majority stakeholders in Stellar Airways. They recently acquired the airline as part of their investment portfolio. This flight was one of their first incognito evaluations of staff performance. From the reports I've been receiving, their experience has been far from acceptable." Hannah's breath caught, and a cold sweat broke out on her forehead as the weight of his words sank in. Owners. The family she had subtly dismissed and disrespected throughout the flight wasn't just any family. They owned the airline. Her thoughts spiraled as she pieced together the implications. Every delay, every dismissive glance, every subtle slight, they hadn't gone unnoticed, not only by the Carters, but likely by other passengers as well. "Captain," Hannah began, her voice trembling. "I didn't know." "That's the problem," Captain Wallace interrupted, his tone sharp and cutting. "You didn't know because you didn't treat them with the same respect you showed the other passengers. And now, this situation is out of my hands. The Carters have requested to meet with you before they leave the airport." Hannah's hands gripped the armrests of the jump seat so tightly that her knuckles turned white. "A meeting?" she asked, her voice cracking. "Captain, surely, it's not up for debate," Wallace said firmly, standing to signal the conversation was over. "This is a directive from corporate. I suggest you prepare yourself to explain your behavior." Hannah sat frozen, her mind racing. A meeting with the owners, the very people she had judged, dismissed, and mistreated without a second thought. The foundation of her confidence and authority felt as if it were crumbling beneath her. She opened her mouth to protest but quickly realized there was no point. She wasn't in control anymore. Captain Wallace straightened his uniform and gestured toward the door. "They're waiting in the VIP lounge. I'll escort you there personally. Let's get this over with." Hannah rose slowly, her legs trembling beneath her. The gravity of the situation was undeniable. This wasn't just a reprimand. This was the kind of moment that could end her career. And she had no one to blame but herself. Following Captain Wallace down the jet bridge, her heart pounded with every step. The fluorescent lights overhead seemed harsher than usual, casting sharp shadows that mirrored the dread pooling in her chest. She struggled to hold on to some semblance of composure, but the whispers of the cabin crew, who had clearly caught wind of what was happening, only deepened her discomfort. When they reached the VIP lounge, the glass doors slid open with a soft hiss. Hannah's eyes immediately landed on Daniel and Alicia Carter, seated in plush armchairs. Daniel looked completely at ease, one leg crossed over the other, with one arm draped casually over the chair. Alicia sat upright, her posture graceful yet commanding, her expression unreadable. Their children were absent, likely being attended to elsewhere, leaving the couple fully focused on the situation at hand. Captain Wallace gestured for Hannah to step inside, but the weight of the moment rooted her to the spot for a second too long. "Go ahead," Wallace said firmly, his tone leaving no room for hesitation. Hannah finally stepped forward, her polished heels clicking against the marble floor. Her usual air of confidence was nowhere to be found. It had been replaced by the overwhelming realization that she was about to answer to the very people she had silently judged and blatantly mistreated. Hannah Brooks stood before Daniel and Alicia Carter, suddenly hyper-aware of how small and powerless she felt. Daniel glanced up at her, his expression calm but piercing. With a nod, he gestured to the chair across from him. "Have a seat," he said simply. Hannah lowered herself into the chair, clasping her hands tightly in her lap to keep them from trembling. Alicia leaned forward slightly, her gaze steady but unyielding. "Hannah, is it?" she asked, her tone cool but polite. "Yes, ma'am," Hannah replied, her voice barely above a whisper. A flush of humiliation crept up her neck, but she forced herself to meet Alicia's eyes. Daniel exchanged a brief glance with his wife before turning his attention back to Hannah. "I'd like to start by asking you a simple question," he said, his voice measured. "Why do you think we're here?" Hannah hesitated, swallowing hard. She wanted to deflect, to shift the conversation away from her actions, but she knew there was no escape. She began, her voice faltering. "I understand there were issues during the flight." Daniel raised an eyebrow, waiting for her to continue. Hannah fidgeted with the hem of her blazer. "I may have mishandled aspects of your service," she admitted, each word feeling like it was dragged from her throat. "Mishandled?" Alicia repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. She exchanged another look with Daniel, who exhaled deeply before leaning forward. "Hannah," Daniel said, his voice soft but firm, "this isn't about a delayed drink order or a poor seating arrangement. This is about respect, or in this case, the lack of it. Throughout that entire flight, you treated us as though we didn't belong. Am I wrong?" Hannah opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped herself. There was no point in lying. They had seen through her actions, just as she feared. "No, sir," she admitted quietly. "You're not wrong." Alicia tilted her head slightly, her expression shifting from stern to something that resembled disappointment. "Do you know how many times we've encountered this kind of treatment?" she asked, her voice calm but cutting. "We've worked hard to build a life where we don't have to justify our presence, but people like you still make us feel like we're trespassing. Why is that?" Hannah's throat tightened, and she couldn't muster a response. Alicia's words cut deeper than she had expected, forcing her to confront the unspoken biases she had buried beneath years of polished professionalism. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his gaze unwavering. "This isn't just about us," he said. "It's about every passenger who's been made to feel less than because of someone else's prejudice. As owners, we have a responsibility to ensure this kind of behavior doesn't exist on our airline." He paused, his expression hardening. "And after today, I'm not sure you belong here." Hannah's eyes widened, panic flooding her chest. "Mr. Carter, please," she stammered. "This was a mistake, a lapse in judgment. I've been with Stellar Airways for 15 years. I'm good at my job. I can learn from this." Daniel studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Alicia, however, was less reserved. "You've been here for 15 years, she said, her voice sharp. "But what have you learned that time? Clearly not how to treat people with respect." Hannah's heart sank further. The silence that followed was deafening, and she realized no carefully chosen words or excuses could undo the damage she had caused. The control she had clung to so tightly during the flight was gone, replaced by the unshakable truth that she had misjudged them, and now she was facing the consequences. Daniel finally broke the silence. "We'll take this matter to corporate," he said calmly. "Your actions today will be reviewed, and a decision will be made about your future with Stellar Airways. But understand this, your behavior is unacceptable. It reflects poorly not just on you, but on the entire company. That's something we can't ignore." Hannah's chest tightened as his words settled over her. There was no room for rebuttal, no space for excuses. All she could do now was brace herself for what came next. Hannah Brooks nodded, her hands trembling in her lap. She wanted to plead further, to defend herself, but she knew it would only make things worse. Instead, she sat in silence, the weight of Daniel and Alicia Carter's words sinking in. The reality of her actions settled over her like a suffocating fog. As Hannah sat frozen in her chair, the gravity of the situation bore down on her. The Carters' calm but firm statements echoed in her mind, dismantling the fragile justifications she had clung to during the flight. She felt exposed, as though every unspoken thought, every subtle bias she had acted on, had been laid bare for all to see. For the first time in her 15 years with Stellar Airways, she felt truly powerless. Daniel leaned forward again, his calm demeanor unshaken. "Hannah," he said, his voice carrying a weight that made her flinch slightly. "We're not here to humiliate you. This isn't about revenge or making a spectacle of what happened. It's about accountability." Hannah nodded stiffly, unsure if she should respond. Her throat felt dry, and her thoughts scrambled for anything that might salvage her position. She began, her voice cracking. She cleared her throat and tried again. "I understand that my actions were inappropriate, and I'm deeply sorry for how I treated you and your family." Alicia's gaze remained steady, her expression unreadable. "Sorry isn't enough, Hannah," she said firmly. "Apologies don't undo the harm caused. What matters is what you choose to do moving forward. Words are easy. Change isn't." Hannah swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the hem of her blazer. She wanted to protest, to insist that she wasn't the person they believed her to be. But deep down, she knew there was truth in Alicia's words. She had allowed her biases to dictate her actions, and now she was paying the price. Daniel leaned back slightly, his tone softening but still resolute. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "Alicia and I will be reporting this incident to corporate. They will decide the next steps. Whether or not you remain with this airline is out of our hands. But know this, your behavior tonight has set a standard we can't ignore." Hannah nodded mutely, feeling a hollow ache in her chest. She had spent her career climbing the ranks, priding herself on her professionalism, only to see it unravel in a single flight. The silence stretched on, but the Carters didn't fill it. Their calm, composed presence amplified the weight of her guilt. Finally, Alicia stood, adjusting her coat with a quiet elegance that deepened Hannah's shame. "We've said what we needed to," Alicia said, her voice cool but resolute. "What happens next is up to you, Hannah. Think carefully about how you carry this forward." Daniel stood as well, extending his hand toward Hannah. She hesitated for a moment before shaking it, his grip firm but measured. "Good luck," he said simply, his tone devoid of malice but filled with finality. As the Carters walked out of the lounge, Hannah sat motionless, her mind a storm of regret and self-recrimination. The echoes of their footsteps faded, leaving her alone with her thoughts and the cold, hard truth. Her actions had brought her to this moment, and there was no one to blame but herself. Moments later, Captain Wallace re-entered the lounge, his expression a mixture of professionalism and pity. "Hannah," he said evenly, "corporate will contact you in the morning. For now, I suggest you take the rest of the week to reflect on this." Hannah nodded silently, rising to her feet. As she left the lounge, the full weight of the situation hit her. Her career, her reputation, everything she had worked for, was now on the line. And it was all because she had allowed her prejudices to dictate her actions. She walked through the bustling airport terminal, her steps heavy and unsteady. The usual hum of activity, families reuniting, professionals hurrying to their gates, announcements echoing overhead, felt distant, like static noise against the storm in her mind. Daniel and Alicia Carter's words replayed endlessly in her thoughts, each one cutting deeper than the last. Their calm, deliberate confrontation carried more weight than any shouting match ever could. Hannah eventually reached the employee parking lot and climbed into her car. Gripping the steering wheel as if it were her only anchor, she stared blankly at the dashboard, her thoughts a chaotic whirlwind. The Carters' faces lingered in her mind, composed yet filled with quiet disappointment. Part of her wanted to feel anger, to blame them for her predicament, but she couldn't. Deep down, she knew the truth. Every choice she had made during that flight had led her to this moment. The drive home was a blur. The city lights streaked past her windows, faint and colorless. She barely registered the turns as her body moved on autopilot, her mind spiraling deeper into self-reflection. It wasn't just about this one incident, she realized. There had been other moments, smaller ones, that she had brushed aside or justified. Subtle actions influenced by biases she had refused to acknowledge. The Carters were simply the first to confront her so openly, forcing her to face what she had ignored for years. When Hannah finally pulled into her driveway, the house felt colder and emptier than usual. She sat in the car for a long moment, unable to bring herself to go inside. She knew the silence of her home would only amplify the storm in her head. Eventually, she gathered herself and stepped out, her heels clicking softly on the hardwood floor as she entered. She dropped her bag by the door and collapsed onto the couch, staring at the ceiling as the reality of her situation pressed down on her. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table, pulling her out of her daze. Hesitating, she picked it up, dreading what awaited her. It was an email from Stellar Airways corporate office. The subject line read, "Immediate review of employee conduct, Hannah Brooks." Her stomach tightened as she opened the message. It was brief but clear. The Carters had filed an official report, and the email outlined the next steps: a meeting with HR, a formal review of her conduct during the flight, and a temporary suspension pending the outcome. There was no mention of termination, but the possibility loomed heavily between the lines. Hannah set the phone down with trembling hands, her mind racing. 15 years of dedication, carefully building her reputation, now teetered on the edge of ruin. Yet deep down, a small voice reminded her this wasn't just about the job. It was about something far greater, something she hadn't allowed herself to confront until now. She leaned forward, burying her face in her hands. For years, she had believed her professionalism shielded her from scrutiny, that it placed her above reproach. But the Carters had pierced through that illusion with quiet precision, forcing her to see herself in a way she never had before. And now, for the first time, she didn't know how to move forward. The next morning, Hannah woke early, her sleep restless and filled with fragmented dreams of the flight. The email from corporate was the first thing on her mind as she opened her eyes, a heavy reminder of what awaited her. She sat with her coffee, staring at the message on her phone. A part of her hoped it was all some misunderstanding that would soon blow over, but she knew better. She spent the morning replaying every interaction with the Carters, trying to pinpoint the exact moment when everything had gone wrong. The truth, however, was undeniable. It wasn't a single moment. It was a pattern of choices, fueled by attitudes and assumptions she hadn't fully examined. And now she was forced to confront them, or risk losing everything. However difficult the fear of losing her job was to endure, something deeper proved even harder to face: shame. It wasn't just one mistake, it was a pattern of subtle, calculated choices born from prejudices Hannah Brooks had refused to acknowledge. She had never thought of herself as someone who discriminated, but her actions spoke louder than her intentions ever could. As the hours passed, Hannah found herself grappling with the realization that her behavior hadn't just jeopardized her job. It had betrayed the very values she thought she stood for. Alicia Carter's sharp words from the lounge echoed in her mind. What have you learned in 15 years? The question haunted her. A stark reminder that her professionalism had been little more than a hollow facade. When the day of her HR meeting arrived, Hannah dressed with care, choosing an outfit that projected competence and seriousness. Yet, as she drove to Stellar Airways headquarters, the city outside her window seemed unusually cold and gray, mirroring the dread that weighed on her chest. The journey felt endless, and by the time she arrived, she was almost numb. The receptionist directed her to a small conference room where an HR representative and a senior manager were waiting. Hannah's heart raced as she stepped inside, but she forced herself to maintain a neutral expression. The manager, a no-nonsense woman named Evelyn Carter, gestured toward a chair. "Please, have a seat," she said. Hannah obeyed, sitting stiffly as Evelyn began speaking. "We're here to address the incident on Flight 417, Evelyn said, her tone professional but firm. "The Carters, as majority stakeholders, have filed a formal complaint regarding your conduct. They've outlined specific concerns about how you handled their service." Hannah nodded, her throat dry. She wanted to speak, to explain herself, but Evelyn raised a hand to stop her. "You'll have an opportunity to respond," Evelyn continued. "But first, I want to be clear, this is not a minor issue. Their complaint isn't just about poor service, it's about behavior that reflects systemic bias. That's something we take very seriously at Stellar Airways." The HR representative, a younger man who looked more uncomfortable than angry, nodded in agreement. "This isn't just about the Carters as individuals," he added. "Their report raises concerns about how this could impact the company's reputation and culture." Hannah swallowed hard, feeling the weight of their words. This wasn't just about her anymore. Her actions had cast a shadow over the entire airline, a brand built on promises of luxury and inclusivity. When Evelyn finally gestured for her to speak, Hannah took a deep breath, trying to steady her voice. "I understand the seriousness of the situation," she began carefully, "and I take full responsibility for my actions on that flight. I didn't treat Mr. and Mrs. Carter with the respect they deserved. I allowed my own assumptions to influence my behavior." Her admission hung in the air, the silence in the room heavy. Hannah felt a flicker of hope that her honesty might count for something, but Evelyn's expression remained stern. "What assumptions are you referring to?" Evelyn asked pointedly, leaning forward slightly. Hannah hesitated. She knew the answer, but saying it aloud felt like stepping into a void. "I assumed they didn't belong in first class," she admitted quietly, her voice almost breaking. "And I let that assumption dictate how I treated them." Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "Do you understand why that's unacceptable? Not just on a personal level, but as a representative of this company?" "Yes," Hannah said quickly. "I do, and I'm truly sorry. I know an apology doesn't erase what I did, but I'm committed to learning from this and making changes." The HR representative scribbled notes on a clipboard, while Evelyn exchanged a glance with him. Hannah's heart sank further. She could tell her words, while sincere, might not be enough to undo the damage. Evelyn leaned back, her expression unchanging, as she prepared to respond. "Hannah, your years of service with Stellar Airways have been exemplary. Until now," Evelyn Carter said, her voice steady but firm. "However, this incident is not something we can overlook. The Carters have every right to expect fair treatment, and their experience reflects poorly on the airline. This isn't just about you, it's about the culture we're striving to foster." Hannah nodded, feeling the sting of tears she refused to let fall. She had prided herself on her professionalism for so long, but now it felt like nothing more than a shield she had used to obscure her own flaws. "We will review this matter thoroughly before making a final decision," Evelyn continued. "For now, you are suspended with pay pending the outcome. You'll be notified of our decision within the week." "Thank you," Hannah replied quietly, her voice barely audible as she stood and left the conference room. The weight of the suspension pressed down on her like a physical burden. Her career hung in the balance, but more than that, she was beginning to realize that her life, as she had known it, might never be the same. The days following Hannah's suspension felt like an eternity. Her usual routine, waking early, putting on her crisp uniform, and stepping onto the plane with a sense of purpose, was gone, leaving an empty void in its place. Each day stretched endlessly as she waited for an update from Stellar Airways. Over and over, she replayed the flight in her mind, trying to pinpoint a single moment she could have changed to prevent the spiral of events. But the answer was always the same. It hadn't been a single moment. It had been every choice she had made, every bias she had allowed to influence her actions. Her phone became both a lifeline and a tormentor. Every time it buzzed, her heart leapt, only to sink when the notification wasn't from corporate. The silence from the airline was unbearable, a constant reminder of the uncertainty looming over her future. Hannah avoided calls from friends and family, unable to face the questions she knew they would ask. The shame of admitting her suspension kept her isolated, trapped with her thoughts. On the third day, an unexpected email broke the monotony. It wasn't from corporate or HR, but from her coworker, Lisa. The subject line read, "Are you okay?" Hannah hesitated before opening it, unsure if she wanted to hear from anyone connected to the flight. The email was brief but sincere. "Hi, Hannah. I just wanted to check in. I know things got tense on the flight, and I heard about your suspension. I hope you're holding up okay. Let me know if you want to talk." Hannah stared at the screen, her emotions conflicted. Lisa had been the closest witness to what had happened during the flight. Though she hadn't said much at the time, Hannah could tell Lisa had disapproved. Still, the email felt genuine. For the first time in days, Hannah felt a small spark of connection. She typed out a quick reply, "Thanks for checking in. It's been a rough week. Maybe we can talk soon." After hitting send, she set her phone down and realized just how lonely she had been. The walls of her apartment seemed to close in tighter with each passing moment, the weight of her suspension growing heavier. That evening, Hannah decided to leave her apartment for the first time since her suspension. She needed air, space, something to distract her from the oppressive silence. She wandered aimlessly through the city, eventually finding herself in a quiet coffee shop tucked away on a side street. Ordering a drink, she chose a seat in the corner, hoping the soft hum of the cafe would drown out her thoughts. As she sipped her coffee, her mind drifted back to the Carters. Their calm, unshakable composure during the flight stood in stark contrast to her own unraveling. She thought about Alicia's words in the lounge, sharp yet measured. "What have you learned in 15 years?" Hannah still had no answer. Her gaze fell on a group of young professionals seated nearby. Their laughter and easy conversation were a stark contrast to her inner turmoil. For a fleeting moment, she envied their carefree demeanor. But then, one of their comments caught her attention. "I read about that Stellar Airways situation," a woman said, leaning forward conspiratorially. "The owners were on a flight, and the crew totally messed up. Can you imagine?" Hannah froze, her coffee cup hovering midway to her lips. Another person chimed in. "Yeah, I saw it online. Apparently, the owners are this super successful black couple, and the staff had no idea who they were. So embarrassing for the airline." The woman shook her head, chuckling softly. "Talk about karma. You can't treat people like that and expect it not to bite you." Hannah's stomach twisted. She hadn't realized how far the story had spread. Hearing strangers discuss it only made it more real and more inescapable. She set her cup down, her appetite for coffee gone, and stared blankly at the table. Her thoughts churned. If people were already talking about the incident, what would happen if she lost her job? Would her name become part of the narrative? The idea of being publicly associated with the mistake sent a fresh wave of anxiety through her. Hannah left the coffee shop in a daze, the overheard conversation playing on repeat in her mind. She realized she wasn't just fighting for her career anymore. She was fighting to preserve the identity she had built for herself. For the first time, she wondered if that identity was worth holding on to at all. The next morning, Hannah awoke to the chime of an email notification. Her breath hitched as she opened it, scanning the message quickly. The subject line read, "Decision regarding suspension. Hannah Brooks." Her stomach churned as she read the first few lines. "Dear Miss Brooks, following a thorough review of the incident on Flight 417 in consultation with the airline's leadership team, including our stakeholders, we have reached a decision regarding your employment with Stellar Airways." Her eyes skimmed down, her heart pounding, and then the words hit her like a blow. "Your employment with Stellar Airways will be terminated effective immediately." Hannah reread the lines several times, as though the words might change if she stared long enough. But they didn't. The email continued, outlining the reasons for her dismissal: violation of company policies on inclusivity, failure to uphold the airline's standards, and the potential damage to its reputation. It ended with a curt note about her severance package and instructions for returning her uniform and credentials. She dropped the phone onto the table, her hands trembling. It was done. The career she had spent 15 years building was gone in an instant. Hannah sat in stunned silence, the enormity of it washing over her. The fear of this moment had consumed her for days, but now that it had arrived, it didn't feel real. It felt as though the ground beneath her had vanished, leaving her suspended in a void. Her first instinct was to call someone, anyone, but she hesitated. Who would understand? Her co-workers would see her as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what could happen if they crossed the line. Her family would likely be supportive, but they wouldn't grasp the full scope of what this meant to her, and she didn't have many friends outside of work. Her life had revolved around Stellar Airways for so long that imagining anything else felt impossible. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. This was her doing. She knew that, but the weight of accountability felt unbearable. What now? How could she move forward when her entire identity was tied to the career she had just lost? Hannah stood abruptly, pacing her small apartment, the question echoing in her mind. Hannah Brooks felt the walls of her apartment closing in again, the silence growing louder with each passing second. Her mind raced with questions she couldn't answer. How would she rebuild? Could she even try? But the hardest question of all gnawed at her relentlessly. Had she truly learned anything? Or was this just another failure she would carry with her forever? The weight of the termination letter clung to her like a shadow. For days, she avoided looking at her email, ignored her phone, and stayed locked inside her apartment. The silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. She couldn't bring herself to face the world. It felt as though everyone already knew, as though her failure was written across her face for strangers to read. On the 5th day, her doorbell rang. Startled, Hannah hesitated before peeking through the peephole. It was Lisa. Hannah froze, unsure if she wanted to see anyone, but eventually she opened the door. Lisa gave her a tentative smile. "Hey," she said softly. "I know you've been going through a lot, so I brought you something." She held up a paper bag with the logo of a local bakery stamped on the side. "It's not much, but I figured you could use something sweet." Hannah stepped aside, letting her in. "Thanks," she murmured, her voice hoarse from days of disuse. They sat at Hannah's small kitchen table, the bakery bag sitting untouched between them. Lisa broke the silence. "I heard about the termination," she said gently. "I'm really sorry, Hannah. I know this must be a lot to handle." Hannah exhaled shakily, her hands fidgeting with the edge of the table. "It's not like I didn't see it coming," she said quietly. "I made my choices, and now I'm paying for them." Lisa nodded, her expression filled with compassion. "I get that," she said. "But you're not the only one who's ever made a mistake. You're just in a situation where it was impossible to hide from the consequences." Hannah looked up, her eyes searching Lisa's face. "Do you think I'm a bad person?" she asked suddenly, her voice cracking. "Because of what I did?" Lisa paused, considering her words carefully. "I don't think you're a bad person, Hannah," she said. "I think you've been carrying biases you didn't even realize you had. And when they got challenged, you acted in a way that hurt people. But recognizing that, that's the first step toward being better." Hannah blinked, her throat tightening. "What if it's too late?" she whispered. "What if I've ruined everything?" "It's not too late," Lisa said firmly. "You lost your job, yes, but you didn't lose your ability to learn, to grow, to change. The question is, are you willing to do the hard work to make that happen?" The words hung in the air, heavy but not crushing. For the first time since her termination, Hannah felt a small flicker of hope. Not because the situation had resolved, it hadn't, but because she realized she still had a choice. The road ahead was uncertain and full of challenges, but perhaps this wasn't the end. Perhaps it was the beginning of something different, something better. She just didn't know what it looked like yet. Hannah sat at the table long after Lisa had left, the bakery bag untouched beside her. The quiet advice Lisa had given echoed in her mind, pulling her out of the fog she had been drowning in. Are you willing to do the hard work? It was a simple question, but the answer felt monumental. Could she truly confront the person she had been and find a way forward? The idea of change terrified her. She had spent so many years building her identity as a professional, confident, composed, untouchable. The cracks in that identity, exposed so brutally by the Carters, left her unsure of who she was without it. But what terrified her more was the thought of staying the same, of letting this moment define her as the woman who failed and never tried to fix it. For the first time in days, Hannah felt ready to consider a new path. Hannah Brooks powered on her laptop, staring at the blank search bar. She hesitated, unsure where to even begin. Slowly, she started typing, unconscious bias and discrimination in the workplace. The search results flooded in, articles, studies, training programs, personal essays. Tentatively, she clicked on one, then another. Soon, she was immersed in stories of people who had recognized their own biases and worked to overcome them. Each story was different, but one common thread ran through them. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. Hannah found herself scrolling through forums and discussion boards, reading candid accounts from people of all walks of life. Some shared their struggles with their own biases. Others described the pain of being on the receiving end of discrimination. One post in particular caught her attention. It was written by a woman who had faced prejudice in her career and decided to turn her experience into a force for good. The woman had founded an organization aimed at fostering inclusivity and accountability in workplaces. The words resonated deeply with Hannah. She thought about Alicia Carter, sitting across from her in the lounge, asking the question that still haunted her. What have you learned in 15 years? Hannah realized she hadn't had a good answer then, but maybe, just maybe, She could start finding one now. Her fingers trembled slightly as she bookmarked several articles and training resources. For the first time, she considered reaching out to a professional organization for help, something she would have scoffed at in the past. But now, the idea of learning from others felt less like a concession and more like a necessity. Hannah wasn't naive. She knew this wouldn't be a quick fix. Undoing years of ingrained attitudes and behaviors would take time and effort, but the alternative, remaining the person who had failed so profoundly, was no longer acceptable. The next morning, she woke with an odd mix of dread and determination. She knew what she needed to do. Picking up her phone, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she'd saved years ago. Her younger sister, Natalie. They hadn't spoken in months. Their relationship had become strained, largely because of Hannah's rigid and often dismissive attitude. Natalie had spent years working as a diversity and inclusion consultant, a career Hannah had never taken seriously. But now, it was Natalie she needed most. Hannah hesitated, her thumb hovering over the call button. Would Natalie even want to hear from her after all this time? As Lisa's words replayed in her mind, "You didn't lose your ability to learn, to grow, to change." Hannah pressed the button and held the phone to her ear. It rang twice before Natalie answered, her voice cautious. "Hannah? This is a surprise." Hannah took a deep breath. "Hi, Natalie. I know it's been a while. I need to talk to you, if you're willing to listen." There was a pause, and Hannah braced herself for rejection. But then Natalie's voice softened. "I'm listening." Hannah didn't hold back. For the first time, she let herself be vulnerable, admitting the mistakes she had made, the biases she hadn't acknowledged, and the consequences that had shattered her career. She didn't try to excuse herself or shift blame. She simply told the truth. When she finished, Natalie was quiet for a moment. Then she spoke. "Hannah," she said finally, "it takes courage to admit what you just did. Most people don't even get to that point. But you need to understand, this isn't about fixing one moment. It's about unlearning years of behavior and committing to real change. That's a long road." "I know," Hannah said, her voice steady but raw. "But I don't want to be the person I was. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." Natalie sighed, and Hannah could almost hear the shift in her tone, a cautious but growing hope. "If you're serious about this, I can help. But it's going to take work. Are you ready for that?" Hannah's chest tightened. She felt the weight of the question, but for the first time, it didn't scare her. "I'm ready," she said simply. And for the first time in weeks, she believed it. Natalie began outlining steps Hannah could take. Resources to explore, courses to enroll in, and conversations to have with herself and others. Hannah listened intently, jotting down notes, already envisioning a different version of herself. One that wasn't defined by her mistakes but by the effort to correct them. It wasn't redemption, at least not yet, but it was a start. Months passed, and Hannah's life looked nothing like it had before. The woman who once stood so firmly in her self-assured authority was now navigating a world of self-discovery, accountability, and growth. It wasn't easy, far from it. Every step along the way forced her to confront parts of herself she had spent years ignoring. But with Natalie's guidance and a determination she hadn't known she possessed, Hannah began the hard work of rebuilding herself. She started small. An online course on unconscious bias and its manifestations in professional environments. At first, the lessons stung. They held up a mirror to the attitudes and assumptions she had carried for years. But instead of retreating, Hannah leaned in. She devoured articles, attended webinars, and even joined a local discussion group that focused on creating inclusive communities. For the first time, she was listening to voices she had once dismissed. Their stories shifted her perspective in ways she hadn't anticipated. One day, as she flipped through her notes from a seminar, Hannah came across the contact information for a nonprofit organization focused on workplace equity. She hesitated before dialing the number, unsure of what she could offer. When the director picked up, Hannah explained her situation honestly, her years in the airline industry, the mistakes she had made, and her desire to contribute to meaningful change. To her surprise, the director was open and encouraging. "People who are willing to own their mistakes and learn from them are exactly the kind of allies we need," they said. "Why don't you come by next week? Let's talk." That meeting marked the beginning of Hannah's second chapter. She started volunteering with the nonprofit, using her experience in the airline industry to help develop training programs for businesses. Her role was small at first, but as she grew more confident, she took on larger responsibilities, speaking at workshops, mentoring younger professionals, and even helping to draft policies aimed at promoting equity in the workplace. The transformation wasn't just professional. Hannah reached out to people she had distanced herself from over the years, including Lisa. They met for coffee one afternoon, and Hannah apologized sincerely for how she had handled their dynamic on the flight. Lisa, ever kind, smiled and said, "I knew there was more to you than what I saw that day. I'm glad you're proving me right." Even the Carters stayed in her thoughts. Their calm strength served as a silent guide for how she approached her new life. One day, Hannah wrote them a letter. She wasn't sure if they would ever read it, but she felt compelled to put her gratitude and apology into words. In the letter, she thanked them for forcing her to confront the parts of herself she had ignored for too long. "Your actions changed my life," she wrote. "Not just by holding me accountable, but by showing me that it's never too late to do better." As Hannah mailed the letter, she felt a quiet sense of closure. She didn't know if the Carters would respond, but she no longer needed them to. The act of writing the letter was enough, a final step in taking responsibility and moving forward. Years later, Hannah stood in front of a packed room at a workplace equity seminar. She was no longer the flight attendant who had let her biases dictate her actions. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone better, someone who had taken failure and used it as a foundation for growth. Standing before the seminar audience, she shared her story with an honesty she once would have avoided. She recounted the mistakes, the biases she had ignored, and the long road she had taken toward accountability and self-improvement. As she spoke, she noticed the way the audience listened, not with judgment, but with hope. When the seminar ended, Hannah stood at the front of the room, looking out over the attendees. Their faces reflected a mix of understanding and encouragement. It was then that she realized she had finally found her answer to Alicia Carter's question. "What have you learned in 15 years?" Her answer? More than she ever imagined. And it was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to give it a like and share your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Top of form, bottom of form.